Critique of Pure Reason, translated by Max Muller, 1881 edition, introduction, page 49. So Kant says that, thus, if we deduct from the representation, Vorstellung, of a body, what belongs to the thinking of the understanding, which is substance, force, divisibility, etc., and likewise, what belongs to sensation, which is impermeability, hardness, color, etc., there still remains something of that empirical intuition and Skong, which is extension and form. These belong to pure intuition, which a priori and even without a real object of the senses or of sensation exists in the mind as a mere form of sensibility. So he says, if we deduct from the representation here means the received effect from an object in the outside world. So as he says previously, that we receive objects from the external world in the form of representations, and these representations, he says, can be defined or can be understood through thinking in terms of what substance they possess and what kind of force or divisibility they have. So he says, from this representation is a unity of substance, force, divisibility, as well as that which belongs to sensation, which is impermeability, hardness, and color. And then he says there is a third element to this representation, which is its extension and form. So he says representation is a unity of things that we can think about an object, such as substance, its force, its divisibility. And representation also includes in it what belongs to sensation, namely matter, which is realized in the form of impermeability, its hardness and its color. And representation also involves something which is extension and form. So he says this third element, this third part of representation, namely extension and form, is a priori, and this aspect of extension and form of an object is present even without any real object of senses. So representation has a pure or a priori part, which is called extension and form, which exists irrespective of a real object of senses or of sensation, and it exists in the mind as a mere form of sensibility. So form of sensibility pertains to the extension and form or order of sensations or order of representations, and the material part of sensation or intuition is given by what we can think about an object, namely the substance, force, divisibility, and what belongs to the sensation itself, what is purely empirical, such as impermeability, hardness, color, etc. So here it is clear that for Kant, an object received in intuition has three parts, namely that which understanding brings forth about an object, which is the substance, force, divisibility. The second element is that which is felt, the physical effect of the object felt in sensation, which is defined in terms of impermeability or hardness or color. And then the third element is a completely a priori and pure form, which is extension and form. So he continues to say, the science of all the principles of sensibility, a priori, I call transcendental aesthetic. There must be such a science forming the first part of the elements of transcendentalism, as opposed to that which treats of the principles of pure thought and which should be called transcendental logic. So he says the science of all the principles of sensibility a priori. So transcendental aesthetic is the science of the a priori part of sensibility, the a priori part of pure intuition or intuition in general. And that system or that science is called transcendental aesthetic. And he says there must be such a science forming the first part of the elements of transcendentalism as opposed to that which treats of the principles of pure thought and which should be called transcendental logic. So he spoke about framing elements of transcendentalism and then framing a doctrine of pure transcendental philosophy. So here he says, in order for us to develop the elements of transcendentalism, the language that he will use here is called transcendental logic. In transcendental, so he continues to say, in transcendental aesthetic, therefore, we shall first isolate sensibility by separating everything which the understanding adds by means of its concepts, so that nothing remains but empirical intuition and scown. So he says, in transcendental aesthetic, what we are interested here is that part of sensibility which is purely conceptual, which pertains to understanding, as opposed to that which contains to the empirical side of intuition. So that is the task of transcendental aesthetic. Secondly, he says, we shall separate from all this that belongs to sensation, Empfindung, so that nothing remains but pure intuition, Reinanskung, and the mere form of the phenomenon, which is the only thing which sensibility a priori can supply. So he says, after separating concepts from empirical intuition, the second step is to remove all that belongs to sensation in order to make intuition pure. And that intuition and that pure intuition looks like a phenomena which contains purely a priori elements in it. So he says, so that nothing remains but pure intuition or the mere form of phenomena, which is the only thing which sensibility a priori can supply. So he says, first of all, what we will do is, in an intuition, in understanding an object, we will separate the concepts. In transcendental aesthetic, we will separate out the concepts from the mere empirical intuition. And then with the empirical intuition, what we will do is we will remove sensation, all that belongs to sensation, and make intuition completely pure, which will lead us to merely the formal element of phenomena as opposed to the material element of phenomena. So he goes on to say, in the course of this investigation, it will appear that there are, as principles of a priori knowledge, two pure forms of sensuous intuition, Anschauung, namely space and time. We now proceed to consider these more in detail. So he says, in the course of this investigation, it will appear that there are, as principles of a priori knowledge, two pure forms of sensuous intuition, namely space and time. So he says, sensuous intuition has pure elements in it, and those pure or a priori elements are nothing but space and time. So once we separate the sensation out of intuition, what will remain is two pure forms of sensuous intuition, two pure forms of a phenomenon, namely space and time.